Welcome to the Information Security Forum podcast. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert, and today we're bringing you a conversation with Steve Durbin, Managing Director of ISF, and plaintiff's attorney Jay Edelson, who takes on big banks, big tech firms, and big pharma. Longtime listeners will know that Steve and I are almost always together in the studio, and Steve is always in the studio along with our guests, but we're recording this at the start of the coronavirus shutdown using some online tools to help us keep going. Jay in Chicago, Steve outside of London, and I, myself, in New York City. We're using some technology to help us keep recording, so you might notice a few minor sound glitches due to our multi-continent connection, but we hope that you'll keep listening and that you enjoy the conversation about privacy, tech companies' impact on society, facial recognition software, and more.
So Jay, thanks very much for coming along. Tell me a little bit about yourself. I mean, what should our listeners know about you and the work that you get up to?
I guess what I'm most known for is my work in privacy. I've been doing plaintiffs' privacy work for about 20 years. And 20 years ago, there really wasn't plaintiffs' privacy work. So the name of the game back then was to take privacy cases and try to package them as cases that look differently. Because if you told the court at the time you were bringing a privacy case, you would get laughed out of court. But we did have cases that we disguised as other ones, which were really privacy cases. And over the last 10 years, we've become really in our view at least, and maybe with big heads, but we've been the leading firm on the plaintiff side in the United States, bringing privacy cases on behalf of consumers and also on behalf of regulators.
And I saw it, I think it was the National Law Journal had recognized you as a cybersecurity trailblazer. I think one of only 2 plaintiffs' attorneys to win that recognition. What was that all about? How does that privacy piece sort of merge into cybersecurity?
Yeah, so privacy in my mind is a broader area, and cybersecurity is part of that. So we do a lot of cybersecurity work, which often is both data breach cases and then data security cases. The difference being a data security cases where you see that a company has vulnerabilities and there's not yet been a breach, but they need to fix it. So that's in the data security space. And then privacy more generally involves companies who are grabbing our personal information and selling it or using it without our consent. Those tend to be the more interesting cases to us, and where we've had just a lot of action in the last 5-10 years.
Yeah, and you recently, or your firm recently settled a case with Facebook, I think, in which they're going to end up paying something like $550 million to the citizens of Illinois. Is that right?
Yeah, the case was brought by us about 5 years ago, and it involves biometric privacy, which in my mind, it's one of the 2 major areas of focus for privacy advocates, the other being geolocation. And what we alleged in the complaint was that Facebook, through its face tagging feature, was actually secretly taking face prints of everybody and amassing this huge, really the largest database of face prints that could be used with facial recognition software in the world. There's an Illinois statute which says you can do that, but you need to get consent. And our argument was they didn't get consent, and we battled it out for a long, long time and reached a settlement which we're very proud of.
Fantastic. And has Facebook made any significant changes to their security and privacy practices as a direct result of that suit, to your knowledge?
Yeah, of course. Yes, that was the settlement. We've announced it in broad terms, and the way it works with the class action is you have to present the exact details to the court, and we'll be detailing the injunctive relief that will come with the settlement. And that will be the specific changes that Facebook has made in response to the lawsuit.
Fantastic. I just want to come back on this biometric piece, facial recognition in particular, because I was asked just the other day to comment on the potential use of facial recognition during this pandemic that we're all going through at the moment as an alternative to perhaps fingerprint technology and so on. And one of the things that concerns me about it is just this general, fairly widespread gathering of facial information. And as in the Facebook case, very often the individual doesn't really know how it's being used, and the way in which it's protected perhaps just varies hugely, both across states in the United States, but also more globally than that. My question for you really is that a very real threat that you see, that facial data being used in the wrong way outside of the Facebook environment? Is it something that worries you more broadly?
Yeah. Facial recognition software and biometrics in general are both incredibly exciting because they can have some terrific uses, and we're seeing that in the pandemic now. Truth is, nobody wants to pay with cash. Nobody wants to touch their finger to a keypad. So to the extent that that you can get a face scan, that's very positive. And we're not anti-technology. We think that's good. But people also have to understand the negative side of it too. And the best example is a company called Clearview, which is a company that was funded by Peter Thiel and run by people associated with Rudy Giuliani. And what they did was they collected the face prints of, I believe, hundreds of millions of people, it seems like, and we're still trying to get our hands on the whole thing, and then started selling to law enforcement, private businesses. They were using it, according to reports, as party tricks, parties to say, oh, we can see where somebody is at this moment. That's the problem. The problem with biometrics and facial recognition in particular is that if a company that doesn't care about our privacy wants to use it negatively, they can then start tracking us everywhere we are. And that is a very scary thing, because if you have a private company or the government tracking where you are, you're going to make different decisions. You're not going to go to the therapy meeting. You're not going to go hang out with certain types of friends. You're not going to go protest. You're not going to engage in a lot of behavior. And at that point, we're living in a different world.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So what is the answer? Is it regulation? I mean, we're talking here about the way potentially that governments are using that sort of biometric information. So is it regulation or is it something else?
It has to be regulation. And the regulation has to come right away. The issue is that Silicon Valley knows far more about what their plans are than we do, and certainly than politicians do. So we're fighting a fight where the other side has way more knowledge than we do. We need regulation in place so that if biometric information is being collected, people have to give consent, that they have a right to control it, they have a right to have the information deleted, and that really does have to come soon.
And what do you think of the current sophistication of regulation? Or perhaps the question is really about the sophistication of the regulators. So what is their level of competence? You've made this point that Silicon Valley, is so far ahead because they're developing the stuff, right? Again, I go back to conversations that I've had in the past when general data protection regulation was being developed across in Europe, when we were talking about certain privacy regulations over in the United States, and congressmen would say to me, there's this reluctance to put regulation on the statute books because, first of all, they don't really understand it. And secondly, things are just moving so very quickly that changes would have to be made, and so would render that regulation or legislation redundant. So what is the answer, I guess, is the real question.
So I actually have a more cynical view even than that. Especially the current administration that we have, I believe that they like the idea that they can track Americans. And we're already seeing some early signs that they might be using this pandemic to try to collect more information about people, to crack down on groups that they don't like immigrant groups, etc. So I don't think that they're terribly motivated to shut this down. I think the Trump administration and the Steve Bannons of the world, their view would be, yes, this is terrific. If we have this, we're going to have an incredible amount of control. In terms of the sophistication of the legislators, I think it's getting better and better. But the companies, for them, this is worth tens of billions of dollars easily in terms of the industry, the biometric industry. And so their lobbying efforts are extreme. that's why in our case, as you mentioned, our $550 million settlement only applied to Illinois residents.
Right.
The reason is because Illinois is the only state that has a biometric privacy law that allows consumers to sue. There's nowhere else where you can do this. So it's very, very hard to get any sort of good legislation passed. We're proud of our home state of Illinois for doing it.
And, just back to that Facebook situation there, is that award, I mean, $550 million for some people listening to this, they may think that's a lot of money. Within the context of Facebook, is that really noticeable? Is that going to make a difference to Facebook?
I think so, yeah. The reason it's going to make a difference to Facebook is because previously, when it had settled consumer privacy cases, it paid $10 or $20 million tops.
Right.
And so because of that, for Facebook, a $20 million settlement is nuisance value. It doesn't affect their business plans. The reason why it was so hard to get a settlement of this size wasn't because Facebook was worried that if they lost $550 million, it would hurt them. They can pay the $550. What they were worried about was setting some sort of precedent where now this is the price for privacy violations. And that's what we're fighting so hard for. Because if the large companies understand that when they do things like this, one state alone might end up getting $500 million, it becomes harder for them to make decisions to sacrifice people's privacy. That's our hope, at least.
So it's all about sending a message. It's all about saying, look, this could be replicated, and if it can happen to Facebook, it can happen to pretty much anybody.
Yeah. Well, it's really setting the market value of these violations. These companies are their businesses, and they look at it and say, look, if a violation is going to make us X amount of money and we're going to pay Y, and Y is 5%, then we'll keep violating. So the goal is to make it so expensive that they say, oh, geez, we ought to follow the law.
Right. So just going back into this whole legislative area, we've decided amongst ourselves that, regulation is the way to go. It has to be the way that things go to protect the rights of the individual. As you look across the different states, maybe internationally, where do you look to for, forward-looking legislation that strikes this balance perhaps between business growth, innovation, and consumer privacy? Has anybody got it right, or is everybody still just sort of feeling their way?
So first, I think that is, with respect, a little bit of a straw man argument. Businesses always say if there's regulation, it's going to stifle innovation. But I think that's a misunderstanding of what most privacy bills do. Most privacy bills don't say you can't collect this information or you can't use it. What they say is you need to get consent. And that is not a big burden on companies. So I don't believe that these privacy bills really stifle innovation, first of all. Second, in terms of who's leading it, I believe it's Illinois. Illinois has very progressive legislators, and partly because they passed this statute, and then after we started gaining ground in the lawsuit, Silicon Valley just swooped in and tried to amend the bill, to gut it, to get rid of our lawsuit. And that ended up, they acted so brazenly that ended up educating a lot of the legislators in a positive way. And now they're really, really committed to broader types of privacy statutes. And frankly, the fact that our suit is able to return $500 million to the Illinois economy isn't the worst kind of backdrop to have as we're debating other types of privacy bills.
No, quite so. Very often when I talk to regulators, legislators, and indeed some companies, not all, we very quickly start talking about the need for privacy by design. So build some of these safeguards in right at the beginning, because as you say, gathering the information itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, provided that the individual has agreed to it being taken, first of all, understands how it will be used, and has a degree of trust with the person who's storing it around the confidentiality and integrity of the data and the use that it's going to be put to. And yet, I suppose there is still this sort of pushback almost that, and I'll just put it to you, that technology and the way in which we use data is just moving so very, very quickly that it's perhaps challenging to build that privacy in by design at the outset, because the technology will change so rapidly over time. So that we're going to have to constantly revisit. And so there has to be a degree of latitude that's allowed. Where do you sit on that? Is that the case in your experience?
You're saying that we should give businesses more latitude? Because if that's your point, I would push back on that. I think that we just have to write the laws in a broad enough way that we can anticipate that there'll be different types of technology. The easiest way to think about it is personally identifiable information.
Right.
A while ago, that meant kind of a specific thing, like your social security number. Now, the way a lot of companies work, if they have your unique identifier associated with your Verizon phone, that's actually better for them than your social security number. There were statutes which were written before and didn't kind of anticipate that companies might find better ways to identify people. And it's been hard convincing courts to interpret those statutes broadly. If the language were different, if they just said kind of anything that might be used to personally identify, then we would have been fine with those statutes. So I think that what you'll see and what you're starting to see is that legislators are just having broader language, understanding that the world is changing, as you're saying, on a day-to-day basis.
And I think for me anyway, what I'm hearing you say is that there is more of an appetite or a willingness on the part of the legislators to accept that actually it isn't, write it once and leave it for the next 10 years. In this kind of space, it needs to be constantly updated and so carefully phrased right at the outset to allow for that. Is that right?
It's true, but it's so hard to get privacy legislation passed that it is very hard to have a strategy of updating it every year or so, because the battles are they're close to existential for a lot of these companies. So what we really, when we talk to legislators, what we say is just the first time, try to capture the idea more than specific behavior. And that ought to be able to then keep up with technology as it changes.
Jay, we talked a lot about the legislator, so that side of the house, but what about the individual? What are the sorts of things that individuals should be doing in this particular space? What some hints and tips for them, if they're concerned about how their data might potentially be used? What are the sorts of things they can look out for?
So a few things. I hate to go back to the legislature when he kind of told me not to, but I think is to speak up and tell in the U.S. tell their state representatives that it's important. I don't think anything positive is going to happen in the federal level with this administration. So it's really all at the state level, and state legislators need to understand that people care about this. Beyond that, I think that people have to be vigilant and be paying attention to what companies can respect their privacy and which ones don't. And the ones that don't, maybe stop doing business with them. And that would send a pretty good message. It's hard to do because most of these companies really don't care that much about people's privacy.
And also, of course, quite difficult sometimes for people to understand who they're actually dealing with. I mean, I'm thinking of, some of these big tech companies we've referred to that are hugely acquisitive, and they're buying, business after business after business, and keeping the same names, but of course sharing the data behind the scenes. So quite difficult for an individual to figure that out. Any sort of references that they can go to, or they can sort of check online or something, or, to figure out who they should be more concerned about than others?
So here's how I think about it. The companies that sell products tend to be better than the ones that don't have real products. And what I mean by that is there are companies like Facebook that doesn't really have products. It's just trading in your data. That's how it's made all its money. Google also, although they have some products too, mostly that's what they're doing is they're trading off data. You look at a company like Apple, where Apple sells things like computers and phones, and that's the bulk of its business. They're much, much better when it comes to privacy. So when you're dealing with companies that are offering, quote, free services and products, that's when you want to kind of pause because they're getting something in exchange for that, and which is fine if they're telling you what it is they're taking. But often those companies, their view is if we're giving it to you for free, we're entitled to everything, whether we tell you or not.
That's a pretty sobering thought, isn't it, for a lot of people? I mean, increasingly during this pandemic, people have been forced to work from home where perhaps they haven't done that before. They're probably discovering new apps, new sort of potential solutions to home working online. And, I'm just sitting here wondering how many people are actually thinking about some of those things. So there's probably an educational need around this as well, isn't there, for us to, just really help people to be more aware of some of the challenges of actually working online. That's going to become more of a challenge, I think, as we go forward. Would you agree?
I would. And I think the pandemic is going to have a lot of impacts on privacy and probably not in a great way. Generally, first of all, when people get scared, it's easier for our lawmakers to do things where we give up privacy. People are willing to give up privacy if they are scared. So that's one thing I'm worried about. Number two, because of the remote learning and remote working that we're doing, I'm sure we're going to see companies take advantage of that. And one lawsuit, which I think everyone should be paying attention to, is a lawsuit that the state of New Mexico brought against Google. And I have to, as a disclaimer, say that our firm is working with New Mexico on this suit. So I'm biased. But the argument that suit is making is that Google, in providing so-called free software to kids for use in schools, was actually taking an incredible wealth of information and tracking the kids. And that is a huge concern that I have, that a lot of companies that are really springing into action to offer products and services to help people work and learn remotely aren't always the most trusted companies. So our firm's very vigilant about that. We're going to be filing a couple of suits in the next few weeks where we expose some of this. And it's going to be a big fight that we have on our hands.
And good luck with that. I think that'll probably run for a little while, right? I mean, these things don't get resolved overnight, I wouldn't think.
They do not get resolved overnight. Just to be clear, Google denies everything and says that we're wrong about the facts and the law. So, they've got a great legal team and they'll make all of their arguments.
Right. I'm sure they'll have the time to do that. Jay, this has been fascinating. Thank you very much indeed for sharing some of your insights on privacy, sharing the work that you've been doing, and just highlighting some of the things that people who are listening to this perhaps hadn't thought of and, will perhaps pay a bit more attention to going forward. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. And, I hope you and all your listeners stay safe and sane during these crazy times.
Thanks very much.
That concludes today's episode, a remote conversation with Steve Durbin of the ISF and myself, Tavia Gilbert. We will continue to change in the ways we need to bring you ongoing content during strange and confusing times. We're glad you're with us. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this conversation, please share it in your networks. Be sure to visit securityforum.org to join the conversation on our LinkedIn group, and take a look at the show notes and download ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance around security best practices, even during a pandemic. Wishing you, your loved ones, and your communities peace and good health. Till next time.